A man who was welcomed into Ireland as a refugee over 2 decades ago and who received Irish citizenship and even had a business here in this country has just been sentenced to 7 years in jail by a Croatian court, and his crime was kidnap and torture. This case is really, really important in the context of everything that Ireland is going through right now in terms of mass immigration. So I think that there's a few things that people need to hear and consider. And if you feel you're one of those people, stay tuned and have a listen to this. There are, of course, people living in Ireland who are genuinely the victims of war and persecution. But, and this is very crucial, although you're not allowed to talk about it, some have fled here because they have been the perpetrators of persecution against others during times of war, and they are trying to escape justice. Take the following case in the Irish Times this week and then ponder some of the questions I will ask. Vaslav Busakovic was welcomed by the state into Ireland and was given Irish citizenship. He lived here for 2 whole decades despite having abducted and tortured villagers and prisoners in the early 1990s. He also set up a business here, and by all accounts, before he was identified as a war criminal, he would have been held up as a refugee success story. The press is presenting to us today that he hid here, but this is not the truth. Conor Gallagher of the Irish Times is presenting this narrative, but to say this is to make it appear as though the Irish government were somehow prevented from looking beyond the story that Busakovic presented when he arrived. No surprises there, given that Gallagher also said Aisling Murphy had been strangled, when in fact she had been all but decapitated. I feel like the Irish Times and Mr. Gallagher are often presenting stories for the state in such a way as to downplay the much more stark reality. It's almost like some so-called journalists are PR handlers for the government. But that's just my humble opinion. To be fair to the Irish Times, they appear to be the only media publication covering this story at all, or at least they were at the time when I made this video today. Anyway, the torturer's background was unchecked when he arrived in Ireland, and of course he was taken at his word that he was a victim in need of protection. 2 years later, he was indicted in absentia by a Croatian court for war crimes, but this monster continued to live amongst us in some poor unsuspecting community for years and years and years. You see, the Department of Justice does not liaise with the governments of those fleeing war and persecution, because, they say, the person could be fleeing from that very government. This information was disclosed as part of a parliamentary FOI response after TD Carol Nolan and former TD turned MEP Michael McNamara submitted a parliamentary FOI inquiry regarding background checks. For this reason, we can presume authorities were unable to locate Busakovic to bring him to trial. In March 2021, the Gardaí signed up to the Schengen Information System, or SIS, a European Union-wide database of wanted suspects and missing people. This will only show people for whom there is an international arrest warrant for terrorism or war crimes, generally. It is not a database for checking criminal backgrounds. There are no routine criminal background checks for refugees or asylum seekers coming to Ireland. Again, this was admitted to in full by the Department of Justice as a result of that parliamentary FOI. Busakovic's presence in Ireland being detected on the Schengen system, along with the existence of an international warrant from the Croatian Ministry of Justice for his arrest, was a very rare case of someone being detected in Ireland for serious crimes. He is an exception, not the rule, and remember, he was here for 2 decades before his crimes came to light. I will include more about that FOI request at the end, which proves unequivocally that background checks are not being done. But for now, let's stick with this war criminal. Busakovic was arrested by Gardaí and brought before the High Court in February 2023. After several hearings, he consented to his extradition in mid-March and was flown to Croatia 10 days later. Note the word consent. There is a difficulty for the state in extradition of someone with citizenship, which is why we shouldn't give it out willy-nilly, particularly to someone we know nothing about. He was sentenced to just 7 years. His victims were non-Serbian residents of the local town he lived in, and the 7-year term was criticised by survivors as being too lenient. They said, he carried out systematic torture which is against international law and a criminal act. For more than 30 years, the accused was inaccessible to the hands of justice. Well, these poor people can blame the Department of Justice in Ireland for much of that. Busakovic's lawyer has appealed the conviction to a higher court and has downplayed the crimes. If the appeal is successful, it is reasonable to presume this man could come back to live in Ireland once again, given he is considered an Irish citizen still. Busakovic is not the first alleged war criminal sought by the Croatian authorities, who was found living in Ireland. In 2014, Đorđe Stojićković was arrested by Gardaí in advance of his extradition to face trial over the inhumane treatment of Croatian prisoners of war in Serbia in 1991. He fought off extradition from Ireland for quite some time. Now, I have some questions I'd like you all to consider. Why have both of these men presumably still got Irish citizenship? How many war criminals are hiding in Ireland in plain sight? How many terrorists are hiding in Ireland in plain sight? Murderers, rapists, and so on and so forth. Especially given that there are no background checks. The Department of Justice and Helen McEntee, who are supposed to protect our borders and the people within them, offer safe haven to war criminals and terrorists, amongst others. This is a great injustice to Irish people, and it's also an injustice to genuine victims of war and persecution, for example, those who have been tortured and have come here for refuge. People who the Department of Justice claim they want to help and support. As I said at the start of this video, there are of course people fleeing war and persecution, but what about those who are fleeing the consequences of the crimes they committed? What about those who have been let out of prison, for example, like those who were let out of prisons in Syria last week? Are all of those people victims? And remember that horror incident in the UK there during the summer that involved the stabbing of little children. As it turns out, that perpetrator was likely not a Christian, as it was originally claimed. He had jihadist terrorist content in his possession. But at the time it was claimed he was a good Christian boy, as opposed to an Islamic extremist man. And as part of the original narrative, we were informed that the perpetrator's family were from Rwanda, and therefore it was assumed they had fled genocidal slaughter. They were indeed from Rwanda, but, and I asked this question at the time, what if they were not persecuted Tutsis, but were in fact Hutus? Did anyone decide to inquire when his parents arrived looking for refuge? How do we know who the real victims are? Is it safe to just presume? Clearly the answer is no. Let's look at yet another situation closer to home. The UK and other countries blocked the entrance of Palestinians after October 7, 2023 due to a heightened security risk. But of course, Ireland did not. Simon Harris has opened the door to Palestinians after he met with King Abdullah of Jordan. King Abdullah decided his country does not want Palestinians despite being a neighbouring country of Palestine, and so instead he gives the Palestinians Jordanian passports on the condition that they pretty much leave after that. They then come to Ireland as Jordanians despite being Palestinians. It's very interesting that the Department of Foreign Affairs recommends an extremely high level of caution for those planning to travel to Jordan from Ireland, but will allow anyone in from Jordan, no questions asked. According to IPAS, the number of asylum seekers arriving in Ireland from Jordan has surged by more than 1,800% in the last 12 to 18 months. How do we know these people are victims? How do we know there's not terrorists or war criminals amongst them? Then there's the issue of people from other countries closer to home. In November, it was reported that Dimitri Saban, who had been on the run since 2021, was arrested after he was caught speeding here. Dimitri's real crime was that he took part in the gang rape of a 16-year-old girl in the UK. An international arrest warrant popped up when he was stopped for speeding, and if he had not been stopped, he would still be here living amongst innocent people in County Kildare. On the other hand, if he had been checked coming in, this arrest warrant would have shown up immediately. Then you have the case of Lauren Spencer, who we interviewed earlier this year. She was kidnapped and raped by Ian Lingwar, a man who had committed other terrible crimes before coming here and targeting both Lauren and a Canadian foreign exchange student. And of course we have Aisling Murphy, who was also targeted by a man who had previously been convicted of rape. So you see, background checks are not happening, and on that note I'll mention a thing or two about Eurodac and Europol, which along with Schengen are two databases often referenced misleadingly by the Irish press and government. Eurodac is another database that stores the fingerprints of international protection applicants or people who have crossed a border illegally, but the Department of Justice has said Eurodac is not a criminal records database. It also said in response to the parliamentary FOI, quote, the underpinning regulations permit law enforcement agencies to compare fingerprints linked to criminal investigations with those contained on Eurodac in certain circumstances involving serious criminal offences, but that, quote, this would only happen as a last resort. GRIP subsequently did an analysis of Eurodac records from 2015 until May 2023, and this showed that there have been 0 instances in which the Irish authorities have used the Eurodac database for the purpose of comparing fingerprint data sets in order to prevent, detect, or investigate terrorist offences or other serious criminal offences. Then you have Europol, which does operate a criminal database called the Europol Information System, or EIS, and it covers all of Europol's mandated crime areas, including terrorism. But the Department of Justice say when processing asylum applicants, checks are not made against the EIS database operated by Europol. So that's it for today. Some food for thought on who might be entering or hiding in Ireland and how little the state does to protect us. The state is then bolstered in their lies by a press who further mislead and obscure the very important facts.